What's going on, everybody? James here from Artificial Entertainment, and today we're going to be covering the initial setup for the updated version for the dynamic parkour tray system. So let's go ahead, open it up, and dive in. So I have here a third-person template, and this is in Unreal Engine 5.1, although this is available in 5.1 through 5.4. So, and we're just covering the initial setup today. There's going to be a lot of videos about this because there's a lot that can be done with this asset. But we're going to be covering the initial setup today. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of things. The first thing is that when you add the asset into your project, you'll get these DPTS underscore assets folder. So this is kind of everything you need right here. Now, I will say if you're using motion warping, the first thing I do recommend doing is enabling this in the plugin settings. You can do this by going up to the top at edit and then click on plugins. And then if you search for motion warp, you will see motion warping. It is labeled as beta, but don't worry, it works. We can just go ahead and click on that. It'll say that it's in beta version, blah, 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 blah. Just click on yes, it's okay. And then we'll go ahead and just restart the editor. All right, so now that we have motion warping enabled, now what we can do is we can go ahead and open up our character blueprint and start setting some things up. So for me, it's going to be the third person blueprints BP third person character. Now, the first thing we need to do is probably the most obvious one, which is add the actor component because that's kind of the main system. So we're going to go up to the components tab. This is next to the My Blueprint by default. Click on add and type in dynamic. If I can type anyways, but you'll see dynamic parkour tray system right there. I'll add that in. And we're also going to add the motion warp. And this is again if you are using motion warping. Now, I will say it is recommended because the system and motion warping work very, very well together. However, it is not necessary. You can use the system as essentially a chooser for actions as well if you would like to use the standard, montage, height, distance, blah, 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 blah. But if you want to make your animations a little bit more modular, you can enable motion warping by adding it in here, and, we're going to do a couple of steps. Now, the last thing that we need to add in is going to be the interface. This has all the events for like actions and certain other things as well. So while it's still in the character blueprint, we're just going to go to class settings, go to the details panel here, look under interfaces, and then under implemented interfaces, go to add and type in DPTS underscore, and you'll see DPTS underscore BPI and add that in. Now from here, we can compile and save, and now we have all the main elements added into our character blueprint. Now we just have to make some adjustments and some calls. This way the system can actually be utilized. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look up, get our event begin play here, because we do want to make sure the system knows which character it's actually using. Now, this is for multiple purposes. First is that the certain things like character movement, collisions, and all of that are handled internally by the system. So it needs a viable character reference in order to be able to actually do everything it needs to do. So what we're going to do is just grab our dynamic parkour tray system from our components list here, pull it into our graph, pull off, and we're going to type in set initial, and you'll see primary functions, set initial references. So we're going to grab this one right here and plug it in off of event begin play. Now you can also, off of a custom event, or, if you have something setting up your initial references through another event, you can do that, totally fine. You just want to make sure that this is called off of event begin play. Now for the character reference, we're just going to pull off and type in self to get a reference to self. Now for those of you who don't know how to do this and I went a little too fast for, I'll just kind of do that a little slower here. So we're just going to pull off, type in self, and you'll see variables get reference to self. Bam. So now that we have this in here, the next thing we need to do is mainly if you're going to be using climbing. So this includes ledge shimmy, free climb, anything that's going to be a climbing based type of action. So non-vaulting, mantling, that type of stuff. And we're going to be doing some modifications because of this in the movement input. So the first thing we're going to want to do is get the control rotation and the vectors, and we're going to highlight these and delete them out because we're actually going to use something else to handle the actual input direction. And the reason for this is because when you're in a climbing state, the system is going to kind of transfer the direction that we're supposed to be moving in based off of the actor's position or actor's rotation. The reason for this is because when you're on a ledge and you move your camera left and right, it will try to assess the direction and change that direction. This is improper when you're moving on a ledge. So to make it so this way things actually move accordingly, it's going to adjust the direction for you automatically, but also reset it back to the control rotation value that it's defaulted in here if we're not climbing. So it's only going to override in points when it needs to. But to be able to set up the override, the only thing we need to do is just right click and we're going to type in adjust input, and you'll see under DPTS functions, adjust input direction. We're going to take this and we're going to plug it in off of triggered, just like so. Now, we want to make sure that we get the forward, back, and left and right plugged into the input here, so we can see that left and right is X, and Y is forward and back at that point. And we're going to take these connections off completely because we actually want to take these values and plug them in. So we're going to take the left, right world direction as well as the scale value and plug that in there. And then the forward back scale value and forward back world direction and plug that in there just like this. Now, as you can see here on the inputs, we have a DPTS reference as well as an actor reference. So for the actor ref, we're just going to pull off, get a reference to self just like before. And then for the DPTS reference, we're just going to get a reference of our component by dragging off from our components list here. So let's grab that, and then we'll go ahead and plug that in. So bam. So now we got that set up. And the last thing, and again, this is for climbing, we're going to get a reference to our system first, pull off, and then get movement input. You'll see this function right here. Now, this is something that's going to be primarily used, again, for climbing. This is not going to influence ground actions or anything like that. It's just to ensure that when you are moving and climbing and doing different things, it's able to properly assess what those input directions are. So we're going to go ahead and plug in the forward, back, and left and right values here. And this is out of the adjust input direction. So we're no longer using this directly. We're plugging this into here, letting it do its adjustments, and then setting that based off of whatever it tells us. Now, one other thing, if we are using motion warping, we need to make sure that the warp targets are updated. So one quick thing that we should do is we're going to go to functions, add a new function, and we're going to call this add or update warp targets. And then we're going to click on this here with this open, with function open, I mean. Expand this it. So with this highlighted here, we're going to go into the details panel, click on input. We're going to change it to a transform because this will make it easier to make 3 more transforms. This way we have 4 total. Now what we're going to want to do is name these warp 1, warp 2, warp 3, and warp 4. And this is just going to be for corresponding warp names that are in the system. If you want to rename them, you're obviously more than welcome to, but this is just so things line up with what you're seeing come through from the system. Now, once we have these made here, we're just going to right click and split the struct pin of all of these, exposing the rotation, location, and scale here. And then we're going to go and drag from our components tab here in our blueprint. We're going to drag a motion warping reference here, pull off of it, and type in add or update warp target. And you see this right here. Now, once we add this in, we're just going to want to right click on the warp target, split the struct pin, and then we're going to hook this up just like so. And we're going to name this warp target name warp 1. Now, because we have 4 locations, we want to make sure to do this 4 times. So I'm just going to grab this, duplicate it, get a second one, and then I'm going to take both of these, duplicate those, and this way now we have 4. And then I'm just going to change the names on these from warp 1 to warp 2, and then warp 3, and then warp 4. Now, we're going to go and just plug in really quickly the location and rotation for the matching names. So warp 1 into warp 1, 2 into 2, 3 into 3, 4 into 4. Now, we're going to ignore the scale value. It's just because transforms come with default with scale. But realistically, the rotation and location being together was just so much easier. So that's the reason why that I'm doing this way. Now, once you have your function set up here, we need to make sure it has locations and an execution. So we're going to go, you'll see interfaces here under your My Blueprint section. So this is coming from the Dynamic Parkour Trace System Blueprint Interface, or DPTS_BPI, that we added earlier in the steps. Now, from here, we're going to look under the primary events, and you're going to see send warp locations. So we're just going to double click on this to add the event in, and then we're going to take our add or update warp target function, and we're going to plug this in just like so with warp 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, one other thing is that the system, again, this is more if you're going to be doing climbing, it does disable rotation values just to ensure that no matter what you have active for rotation values, it's able to disable it accordingly, because otherwise certain things might get messed up depending on what your rotation that you're using is. So in order to ensure that after the system does what it needs to do, you're back on the ground and you're walking, and you want to make sure that anything that you have that's unique to your game as far as like rotation, gravity scales, all that type of stuff, there's actually a newly made execution event that's inside of the primary events tab here, and you'll see it as action ended execution. Now, what this is that allows you to be able to have a specific execution that is going to only occur at the end of actions. So which means that this allows you to be able to reset values that you might want to ensure are, again, reset back to the values that are unique to your game. Certain ones are reset to whatever the engine's default is, such as gravity scale being set to 1.75. However, my personal preference is actually a little bit of a lower value, but because it's the default value, I felt that it was the best one to have just set it as the default. But with this action ended execution, we can do a bunch of things like, we'll go ahead and grab our character movement, and we're going to go set orient rotation to movement. So we'll go ahead and just set this to true. So this way, whenever I'm done climbing or done doing whatever, it'll set that to true. And then we'll set gravity scale to, let's say, 1.2 instead of the default 1.75. So this would be something just to get it back to whatever its default rotation would be, and then setting your custom grav scale. But again, anything that you want to happen after an action, you can put off of this event. Now, once we have our warp locations being set, we have certain resets happening within our graph, and we told, what our initial references are and all that good stuff. Now it's time to actually call the execution of the actual system. So we're going to grab a reference of it. I'm just going to grab this and highlight it, and then Control D to get a duplicate. And there's two different ways that you can set up the call of this system. The first way is just using a custom input action, custom key, whatever you want to use. And this is going to be the first way I'm going to show you. But there's also the ability to set it up utilizing the jump input, and it'll handle jumping internally utilizing, certain things like if it finds an action, or if it doesn't, it'll jump instead. So but what we're going to do is I'm going to show you guys the first with just kind of a standard keyboard event, and then we'll show you the jump input. So we're just going to get keyboard event E, and then from the dynamic parkour trace system reference here, just going to pull off and execute trace. Now we're going to get this one, not the in-air trace. And then we're just going to go ahead and put that off on there, and then boom. Now we have the call to our system. So there's no need for setting like branch values and checking system, like internal values. All of that is now handled internally. We don't need to worry about that anymore. But what we're going to also want to do realistically, because we want to make sure we have actions, if we look at the interfaces here, if we look at the action events, you'll see that there are a ton of action events. We have on-ledge actions, tic-tac, corner transitions, climb jump directions, and then the usual vault mantle, all that good stuff. So for the demonstration here, I'm going to go ahead and get the vault action here, and I'm going to bring it over to this area of my graph. Now, we also have, just like in the old system, where we can allow certain actions. Now, I'm going to be doing a more expansive coverage of the settings menu. This way you guys know more about it. But for this one, I'm just going to kind of run through a couple of things. So ground action settings here and climb settings are where you're going to find the allowed actions menu for their respective actions. So climb settings is like on ledge actions, corner transitions, things like that. Meanwhile, the ground action settings are all of your vault, mantle, low jump, scap actions, all that good stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that all of these actions are disabled for right now, because we want to just make sure that vaulting is allowed for at the moment. And then we're going to run through other things again in other videos. So we're just going to turn all of these options off here. So you see I'm just going to each action, going to the allowed actions list, and then just disabling. And then I'm going to go into vault. And we're going to start off with just the short distance vault. Now, there is a better way to set up the montages than what I had shown previously. So what we can do is we're just going to pull off of the event for the DPS BPI here, the vault action. And we're just going to type in play montage. We're not actually going to do a switch with like a bunch of these anymore. We're going to do something a little more clever. But we're going to want to grab a mesh reference here. Get the in skeletal mesh component reference here. And then the montage to play, we're actually going to pull off of this, and we're going to type in select. You'll see under utilities, we'll have a select node here. And then from the vault action type, we're going to plug this into the index. And this will allow us to then have a list of montages based off of what the action type is. Now, this allows you to be able to set a play rate, but it will set the play rate for all of them. If you want to have individual play rates, you can just do the same thing by doing a select node, or nope, not select float, I apologize, select, and then plugging in the vault action type here. So this way you can set the individual values for each montage if you would like. But this is the most effective way and the most optimized way of being able to get the actions. Now, I don't have any montages right now because we're going to be covering that later on. But the first thing I wanted to show you guys is just how to get the kind of the setup here and the best way to call the events. Now, one other thing I just want to cover really quickly before I start showing you how the system is going to work and things like that. There is additional things that we can do inside of the system that allow us to be able to have a little bit more unique control over how things are going to behave. And that's ultimately the sprinting variable. Now, it's built into the system here, so if I pull off of the dynamic parkour trace system reference that I have here, type in sprint, you'll see get sprint or set sprint. What you would want to do is make sure that if you are using the sprint to modify action, which we are going to be covering modified actions in the next video, But you would want to make sure to put this into your sprinting code. So to make sure to set it to true when your sprinting value is set to true, and false when your sprinting value is set to false. So it doesn't require anything additional, like as far as like execution goes, just requires you to put this into your already pre-existing sprinting function. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the settings menu here, and we're going to go to the miscellaneous override. So this is kind of the new replacement for the previous debug menu, and we're going to override motion warp and action output settings, and we're going to show debug spheres here. And then we're going to compile and save, and then we're just going to click on play. Now, the one thing you'll notice is you won't see anything happening on any of these actions because I got to put a proper item in here. But realistically, we do have actually a nice map here. If you open up the DPTS assets, demo, map, you'll see demo map open up right here. So essentially, if I go and I hit E, you're going to see that now we have spheres being traced. So these are the colorized spheres that are going to kind of tell you what locations you want to use when you're setting up motion warping. Height being yellow, blue being depth, green generally being land, and miscellaneous is red, and this is used for different actions of different types. Now, another thing I want to show you guys is we look in the settings menus here, you're going to see initial area trace and object trace settings. We're going to open up the trace options here for both of these because I want to show you the how the trace runs. So we're going to go click on for duration, and we're going to click on this one to for duration. So this is just setting the draw debug type. So I'm going to hit compile and save, hit play. This way you guys can see how the traces are now running. So if you look, you'll see that the trace no longer runs above the character. And if I hit E, it actually just runs to character height. So there's no longer any issues regarding like trying to use this in small spaces or using this in environments. There are blocking checks to make sure that there's no height block or additional objects in our way, but it's much more refined now, allowing you to be able to use it in any tight spaces that you would really want to. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how to be able to set up the jump input. So when setting up the jump here, actually, you know what, before we do that, I apologize. I'm going to show you guys one last thing, because wall running and attach to ledge from air, if you are using either of these actions, they require an additional trace, which is one that you guys might have seen when we were looking at the execute trace function earlier, which is execute in air trace. So you're going to see it under the dynamic parkour trace system. So you'll see it actually give me a nice reference here that I can use, and then bam. So if you do this, and what'll happen is it'll allow, if you have wall running being allowed or the attached to ledge function being allowed, this is the trace that's actually going to run it. We're going to go into more detail about this later, but the reason why I wanted to show this is because this is the setup you would need to have if you are using your own custom input. However, if we are using the jump input, this does change a little bit because, again, jumping is handled internally, so there's no reason why this can't be handled internally as well. So we're going to delete this off here. And again, we're going to cover this in another video when we go over climbing and additional actions. But we're going to go ahead and take E off, and then we're going to take the execute trace, and we're going to take jump and remove it. Because again, jumping is handled internally now. So go ahead and just put it off of started, not triggered. And then we're also going to, accidentally clicked on the trace system, my bad. We're going to go to the dynamic parkour trace system here. And under, again, the settings menu, we're going to go to the action modifications settings here. And we're going to click on use jump input. So this is going to then allow us to be able to still jump. However, if we find an action, you can see that it's still jumping, it's still tracing and doing, but now every time I jump, it's also tracing. However, if I go up to this, you'll see that it does not jump because it found an action. However, if I go up to here because the action is not allowed, it jumps instead. So even though it's still tracing, because the system is still tracing the world and the objects around you, it's actually providing back the proper sense of jump or not jump based off of if an action is not only found, but if it's allowed. There's a lot of different settings here for how you can actually control things. There is an entire list of settings here. We got trace distance and trace height. So let's say, for example, we'll go to the initial area here. If we take the max trace height or distance, so let's say we set this from 250 to 650, and we'll set the trace height from 220 to, I don't know, we'll go 450. Okay, and then we'll compile and save. And then if I do this, you'll see the trace runs significantly higher and significantly farther forward. So you've got full control over that through these. And then let's say also we don't want it to run that low. You want it to run a little bit higher. Well, you can just set the trace offset start to 0, and it'll basically start right at actor height. So you got full control over how everything is actually going to operate. And it's entirely up to you as to how things run. And you even have, again, as we kind of discussed, individual trace options for trace channels, draw debug options, colors, all that good stuff. So you can control almost everything without the system not only views in a debug mode, but also how the system is going to operate. Now, a couple of notes about the system's settings here. If we go into the object obstacle options, the classification options. So this one right here, object/obstacle classification options. You're going to see that now you can also define min-max for low, medium, wall, as well as obstacle, min-max, and platform min-max. And this is the top length. So this is like what constitutes an over action or an onto action based off of the dimensions of the object itself. Now, again, there's so much more to this, and we're going to be covering all of the settings menus and stuff in other videos, but this is pretty much all you really need to do. And then from here, we're going to do some motion warping, set up on an animation, and get that started. So it's going to be in the next video, guys, just because, some people may not want to use motion warping. And if you don't, I'm not going to force it onto you. But in order to actually just get the calls and traces and everything running, as you guys saw, this is kind of it. We just called. You don't even need this or this if you're not doing climbing. This is only if you're using jump input. Again, this is only if you're using motion warping. Same with this. So, depending on what you're using for the system, it's entirely up to you as to how, but this is literally everything you would need in order to ensure that it's going to work. From there, it's just setting up the motion warping settings. So I will see you guys in that video. But for now, stay tuned, stay animated.